In this movie, we will begin to create a functional user interface. That is, a form which has the user in mind. There are many ways you can make your Visual Basic project much more user-friendly and adaptable to the user's needs. As you can see, I have this program called Address Label Maker that will allow the user to enter their name, street, city, state, and zip code, and then by clicking a button you will then create a mailing label. We're not concerned about the code to create the creating label right now. We will in due time. But at this point I want to focus on the functionality of the labels and text boxes on the form. Of course, if I run this program, I could simply enter the data by either using the mouse to move from one text box to the next. I could also use the tab key to enter the data. And the program does indeed work. However, we want to give the user an alternative to using either the tab key or the mouse. This alternative is through the use of what's referred to as access keys. Access keys do not require any coding, and you can create them very easily. All I want to do is to create an access key for the label which is associated with the text box where I will enter the first name. So I click on the address for the first name and go to the text box where the words first name appear, and I'm simply inserting an ampersand before the letter F in first name. We can see the ampersand in the property window, but what the user will see is what is shown on the form, and that is an underlined letter under the letter F. And that is a visual cue to the user that they can now press the letter F along with the Alt key to activate that item. Likewise, for the last name, I can enter an ampersand before the L in last name. Now, I'm using the first letter of each of these words simply as a matter of convenience. Nothing says they have to be the first letter, and we'll see that in a moment. So I created street with an underscore under the C, this S. I'm now creating city, access key of C, placing the ampersand before the letter C. Now I've already used the letter S in street, so to avoid a conflict I'm going to use the letter T, the second letter, in the word state. So that will become my access key for state. And then zip code will be Z. So now I have an access key associated with each label, which is in turn associated with each text box. You might ask, well, how does this association between labels and text boxes exist? And that is through the property called tab index. If we focus on the label first name, we see there's a tab index of 0. That is the lowest possible tab index there is. That is, that's where the focus will begin. However, in Visual Basic, labels cannot receive focus. They instead transfer the focus immediately to the next item that has the next highest tab index. So in this case, our text box immediately beside first name is going to have a tab index of 1. So therefore, the focus will begin at that location. Last name in turn has a tab index of 2, but again, remember, labels cannot receive focus, so the text box adjacent to it will actually receive the focus when the user presses the Alt-L access key, since that has the next tab index. And then the rest follow in suit. Street, city has a tab index of 6, followed by 7. State has a tab index of 8, followed by 9 in the text box, and zip code has a tab index of 10, and its corresponding text box has a tab index of 11. So each of my text boxes now will receive focus in turn based on the user's use of the access keys. So let's run this. As you might expect, the first name already has the focus, so there's nothing else to do there but type in the first name. Now, instead of using the tab key or the mouse, I'm going to press Alt L, which is my access key for last name. I will then type in the last name, and then I will use the Alt S for the street. Now let's say I want to skip the city and go directly to the zip code. I can do so now that I have access keys without tabbing or using the mouse. I can simply hold down the Alt key and press Z, and that takes me directly to the zip code text box. I'll type in the zip code, and now I'll return to the city perhaps by pressing Alt C, and I will enter the city, and then Alt T, since that's my access key for the state, and then click Create Label, and as you can see, my project is still working just fine. But the key here is the use of the access keys. As your programs become more complex, you will want to make your programs as functional and as user-friendly as possible. Making good use of access keys is a great way of doing that. This movie will focus on the concept of tab order. You should take care in the order that you place items on a form, because that will determine the default tab order. That is, when you place a control on a form, the order in which you place it on the form has an effect on the order of the tab index. Let me demonstrate. If I place a button on the form, followed by a second button, followed by a third button, the order in which I just placed those objects on the form is determining their tab index. For example, if I focus on button 1, that has a tab index of 0. Tab index of 0 is the lowest tab index that can be placed on an object on a form. That is, when the project will execute, it will look for the object that has the tab index of 0 to start the focus. Then it will look at the next object which has the next highest tab index, or in this case, tab index of 1, which is associated with button 2. And of course, button 3 has the next tab index, which is tab index of 2. So as I run this project, and you notice that by default the focus is on button 1, I'm now using the tab key, and the focus is now on button 2, and then button 3, and then it starts back over to button 1, button 2, button 3, and so forth. If I now introduce another button into the mix by inserting it in between button 1 and 2, now I have a button 4 in between button 1 and 2. However, since this was the fourth item I placed on the form, and button 3 was the previously last item placed on the form, which had a tab index of 2, button 4 now has a tab index of 3. So even though the order on the form would indicate that the focus would move from button 1 to button 4 to button 2 to button 3, that's not how it will occur. Allow me to demonstrate. Again, the project is running. I press the tab key, and it jumps from button 1 to button 2. Press tab again, the focus jumps to button 3. Press tab one more time, the focus now is on button 4, because that is following the next tab index. Then when I press the tab key again, it goes back to button 1, followed by button 2. Again, button 4 is skipped over. The physical placement on the form is not the key here. The key here is the tab index. So if you create a project such as this and you wanted to correct the tab order, by that I mean you wanted the user to be able to tab in the physical order, you could simply change the tab index. Button 1 is fine because that has a tab index of 0, that's where we want to start. However, button 4 should have a tab index of 1 now. So you simply go to the tab index and change that to a number 1. Button 2 should then have a tab index of 2. Again, following in order 0, 1, 2. And then finally button 3 should have a tab index of 3. So now when we run this project, the focus should follow physically as well as logically. So when I tab, it jumps from the next button just as you designed it to. So as you're developing and designing projects, keep in mind that you can, number one, you can place items on the form in the order in which you want their tab index to appear. On the other hand, oftentimes you modify an existing program and you have to alter the tab index. So that is the other alternative, to go back and alter the tab indexes so that they agree with the physical order of the form itself. We will now take a look at the code that is associated with our address label maker program. As you'll recall, this program allows the user to enter data and then click on the Create Label button, which in turn creates a mailing label. Now if we look closely at the results, as we see the first and last name have been joined together, separated by a space in the first line. The street address has been copied directly down into the second line, and then the third line consists of three components: the city, the state, and the zip code. And if you look closely, there has been a comma inserted in between the city and the state. That comma was not typed in, it has been inserted by the code. So to understand this code, let's stop the program and double click on the Create Label code window. Let's close these other windows so we can get a better look at the code itself. Now this is associated with the button called Create Label button, and it's associated with the click event. And as the comment tells us, this will create a complete address label. Now as you notice, there were 3 lines of the address. These were named, or these are named for the labels that make up those 3 lines. That is the name label, the street label, and the city, state, and zip label. The name label consists of 2 components: the contents of the first name text box, which can be accessed as first name text box.text, and then the last part is the last name text box.text. That's where we get the actual name from. However, the secret in the coding is the use of the ampersands. The ampersand is known as the concatenation symbol. Concatenation simply means to join together. So what we're doing literally in this code is joining together the first name and the last name that has been typed into the text boxes respectively. In between, we're inserting a blank space. This blank space is very important. If this blank space were not here, that's in double quotes, such as first name text box and last name text box, if I were to run this real quickly, just looking at the first and last name, and click on Create Label, you see that the name has been run together without any spaces. So the importance of the space is obvious. So for that reason, we're joining together actually 3 things: the first name, a space, and the last name. Each part is being joined together by an ampersand. The street label is made up of simply the contents of the street text box. So that's very simple, no concatenations necessary. The third and final line is the city, state, and zip code, which consists of the city text box, the state text box, and the zip code text box. In between these 3 things, we are joining together with ampersands. In the case of the city and state, we want a comma to appear immediately after the city, followed by a space. So literally we have inside quotation marks a comma and a space. And then after the state we want 2 blank spaces. So literally there are 2 blank spaces within quotation marks in between the state and the zip code. Note that there is an ampersand before and after each item that's being joined. In this movie I will discuss creating tooltips. Tooltips by default are not a property that is associated with every control in the form. That is, if I click in the first name text box and scroll through the properties list, you'll notice where you typically would expect to find the property called tooltip, that is in the area in the T's, it is not there. Okay? There is no tooltip by default in the properties window. However, there is a way to add this tooltip control to the properties list, and that is by going to the tooltip box or the toolbox and simply double clicking the tooltip control. In the toolbox under the common controls grouping you will find the tooltip control. By double clicking that tooltip control, you then place the tooltip control in a special area called the components tray. The components tray is an area that makes itself available to all the controls on the form. This is where controls are available to the entire form are placed, and as your projects become more complex, we'll be using this components tray area more and more often. But for now, we'll simply use the tooltip in our application. When I return to the form and click on the first name text box, now if I scroll through the properties list, you'll see that there is indeed a property called tooltip. Now the difference here is we simply have added the tooltip to the components tray. And now every control on the form has a tooltip property associated with it. To create the text for the tooltip, I simply enter a phrase such as enter your first name or whatever you would like the user to see when the tooltip is activated. I can do likewise for the last name. I'll click on the last name text box, return to the properties window, and enter the appropriate text. Enter your last name. And of course I could do this for all the controls on the form. And I'm associating these with the text box themselves, and quite simply that's all there is to it. Let's run the application. Now at runtime, when I move the mouse over the first name text box, you will see a phrase that says enter your first name in a bubble. And likewise for the last name, you'll see the tooltip enter your last name. You can associate a tooltip with any control that's currently on the form. I'll stop the program and return to the form at design time. I'll create a tooltip for the Create Label button. So the first thing I want to do is to activate the Create Label button and return to the Properties window, and you'll notice there is indeed a tooltip property. Once again, recognize that I only need to add the tooltip once to the components tray, and now it's available to all the controls that are currently on the form. So in the same manner as I did for the text boxes, I can now enter a message such as press this button to create the label, or whatever it is that you would like for the user to see. Of course, in this case the project is fairly simple and the button itself may be self-explanatory. But you'll find that this technique of using tooltips will be very useful to direct your user and to give them some helpful hints in using the application effectively. So let's test our program out one more time, and you'll see as I hover the mouse over the Create Label button, I indeed see the tooltip press this button to create the label. One last note about the tooltip property. Just like the tooltip component is added to the components tray, it can also be deleted. So if I were to select it, right-click it, that is the tooltip in the components tray, could right-click and then choose Delete. Making sure I'm not at runtime, right-click, Delete. As you can see, the tooltip has been deleted from the components tray, and the resulting text have also been deleted from the controls that belong to the form. So the tooltip has to be in the components tray in order for the tooltip to actually work in your project. In this movie, we will use our address label maker program one more time to discuss two of the properties associated with the entire form. Instead of each individual control, these two properties I'm going to mention are associated with the entire form. First, we will look at the start position property. Making sure that you have the form itself as the focus, and you can tell this by looking at the top of the properties window, and it should say Form 1, unless of course you've renamed the form, which we will discuss later. In the Form 1 properties, that is the start position property, and clicking the drop down arrow, you will see that there are 5 different settings that you have to choose from. The 5 settings are manual, center screen, Windows default location, Windows default bounds, and center parent. We will explore 4 of these since the center parent is dependent upon having multiple forms, which will be discussed later. When you choose manual as the start position, you are asking Windows to allow you or the user to adjust the start position of the form at runtime in this manner. So when I run the project, by default it starts in the upper left corner of the screen, and then I can simply manually readjust it or move it around however I would like to. You can also allow the user to adjust the height and width and the overall size of the form itself by using the sizing handles and so forth. Returning to the start position property for the form, the center screen start position setting, when executed, will just as you might expect, will put the form in the middle of the screen. Again, to demonstrate, when I run it, as you can see, the form is in the middle of the screen. The user is still free to move the form around, so if you want your form to always start in the middle of the screen, you would choose center screen as the form start position setting. Looking at the next start position, which is Windows default location, when we execute, the Windows default location is wherever the Windows default location is for your computer. Now this could vary slightly, particularly when you change resolution of your monitor. But this will go to a specified location that is known as the Windows default location. Returning one more time to the start position property, and this time we will select the Windows default bounds. Now when I execute this form, the start position as Windows default bounds, you'll notice that the form has now changed size. There is a default size that is associated within the Visual Studio environment that will assume that your form should take on this size unless you otherwise specify. So typically you would use one of the following properties for your Windows startup position. You typically use manual, center screen, or Windows default location. As I mentioned earlier, center parent will be used when you have multiple forms. Now there is one other property that we want to take a look at, and that is the Windows state property, which is located all the way at the bottom of the alphabetical properties list. By default, the Windows state property is normal, and that's what you've been seeing in all these demonstrations. If, on the other hand, you would like for the window upon startup to become minimized, that is, to be put down in the system tray, but it'd be minimized but available, you could choose minimized. If you select maximized, then when you run the program, just as you might expect, the window would be automatically maximized as if the user had clicked the maximize button. So I'll choose maximized and run the project. And as you can see, the form is taking up the entire window, that is, it is being maximized. Of course, the user could choose the restore button, which would then restore it down to its default size.
Hey Playboy, it's about time, and your time's up. I had to do this one for my girls, you know. Sometimes you gotta act like you don't care.